Hello, my name is Erin Kern, and I'm a geography student at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. Today I'm going to talk about vulnerability and access to parks in the Twin Cities metro area. So first, some background on this issue. Here's an article called More Kids in the Woods, Reconnecting Americans with Nature. This article speaks a lot about how kids growing up today do not experience nature as much as past generations. A whole generation of Americans is growing up detached from nature, so says the article. And now we're seeing that some 80% of Americans live in metropolitan areas with fewer connections to rural areas than ever. So why is this a problem? This is a problem because of an idea called biophilia. And here's an article talking more about the idea of biophilia. And this is the idea that humans evolved with nature and therefore need nature in our lives to function the best. In this article, biophilia, does visual contact with nature help impact on health and well-being? Says that nature can offer positive effects on health and well-being, and that research on this seems to be reasonably well substantiated. So this is why it's a problem that not as many kids are growing up with nature, because it's clear that they need nature in their lives to thrive. And here's another idea that supports this. It's called nature deficit disorder. So nature deficit disorder is not an official diagnosis. However, it's the idea that children who don't have access to nature and don't have nature in their everyday lives are not as well functioning as other children. And here's another article that supports this. This article is called Do Our Kids Have Nature Deficit Disorder? And it states that researchers are assembling a growing body of evidence that strongly suggests the importance of nature to children's health and their ability to learn. And several studies have been done on children in schools that have a lot of connection to nature and sometimes outside classrooms, and they have found significant student gains in social studies, science, language arts, and math for these children who do spend a lot of time outside. Even outside of this nature deficit disorder, so if you don't even believe in these ideas or biophilia, there has been research done that proves that children with ADHD function better after a walk in the park rather than a downtown walk or neighborhood walk. So connecting kids with nature with real disabilities truly does help them. And there are several more benefits to having greener, more biophilic cities. Cities are far more resilient if there are a lot of more nature aspects in these cities. And so resilient means if a natural disaster does occur, the city isn't necessarily protected from the natural disaster, but it recovers well after the natural disaster. And this article here, Biophilic Cities Are Sustainable Resilient Cities, states that cities with more extensive networks of parks and green spaces are also likely to fare better in the face of long-term climate change. So while nature in cities has great effects for children and nature deficit disorder, it also has several other positive effects on the rest of the community. So the research question for this presentation is, can spatial analysis provide insight on whether or not more vulnerable communities are in areas with fewer parks and less access to nature? So the way we went about this was vulnerability is first mapped to show where the most vulnerable people in the Twin Cities metro area are. So this study is focused on the 7-county Twin Cities metro area. The second thing we did was map access to parks to show which areas of the Twin Cities have the best access to parks. And then we used zonal statistics to combine those maps to understand the relationship between vulnerability and access to parks and nature. So the first thing we did was map vulnerability, and we used percent English speakers, rent burdened, and percent white to map vulnerability. So the most vulnerable people, according to this study, are severely rent burdened, greater percent minority, and do not speak English. And here's the map of the most vulnerable people in the Twin Cities. The darkest red areas are where the most vulnerable people are, and the darkest green areas are where the least vulnerable people are. Next, we mapped amenities. So amenities means green spaces, trees, rivers that are in a neighborhood. So this table on the left shows which amenities got which score for this particular model. So things like lakes and ponds and tree canopies and rivers got very high scores, whereas things like buildings and extraction or mining got very low scores. And so this map on the right is the map of amenities in the Twin Cities area. So the darkest green areas are where the most amenities are, and the brightest white areas are where the least amenities are. So next we mapped friction of distance, so we could map access to parks. So what is friction of distance? Friction of distance is how hard it would be to get to a park from where you currently are. So if you live 200 meters away from a park, but there's a major highway in between you, you're never going to go to that park. So, of all the land use areas in the Twin Cities, each was given a score and then applied to a map so we could see how easy it is for someone to access a park. So things like single-family homes, parks, multifamily homes, things like that were given very low scores because it would be very easy for someone to get to a park through those areas. But things like industrial areas or, again, mining, major highways, major railways are given very high scores because it would be very difficult to get to the other side of that, get through that to get to a park. So here's the map of access to parks in the Twin Cities. The darkest green areas have the best access, and the dark red have the worst access. And you can see there's a lot of dark red here on the bottom of the map, and that's because a lot of those areas are farming areas and agricultural, so there's not a lot of parks out there. And you could argue that it's still a great place to be because they do have a lot of exposure to nature and the rolling hills of grain, but there just aren't a lot of parks down there, so that's why it's harder for them to access parks. So then what do we do with this information? We put together a neighborhood score. So a neighborhood score is amenities minus access. So if you have great amenities and great access, so say you have a score of 10 for amenities and a score of 0 for access because it's not hard for you to get to a park, then you'd have a score of 10 for a neighborhood score. And the higher your neighborhood score is, the better your neighborhood. And here's the model describing how that was mapped. And this is the map of the Twin Cities with neighborhood scores. So the darkest red are the worst neighborhoods, and the darkest green are the best neighborhoods. And overlaid on this map are where areas of water are, so it's easy to see where neighborhoods are around water. And then this is a GIF of vulnerability overlaid over this map. So you can see that black, where the least vulnerable people are, is frequently in areas where there's a lot of dark green, so good neighborhood scores. In white, where there are a lot of very vulnerable people, where the most vulnerable people are, is on areas of red, so bad neighborhood scores. And here's a more zoomed in map to see that better. Especially in this downtown area, there's a lot of white and overlaid on a lot of red areas. And here's the scatter plot of good neighborhood scores and vulnerability. So while that map may give us some insights and may show us some things, this scatter plot really confirms the fact that the more vulnerable you are, the more likely you are to live in a bad neighborhood. And so we mapped some of the outliers of this neighborhood. So this one is a very vulnerable neighborhood where a lot of vulnerable people live, and yet they have a pretty good neighborhood score. And so we zoomed in on this area, and as it's easy to see, there's only a few people that live here, and it's right on a river. So yes, this is a great neighborhood, and maybe these people do live in a great place, but there are very few people who live here, so it's not necessarily a great neighborhood because there's not a lot of people benefiting from this great access to nature. And here's a photo of people who are not vulnerable but don't have a great neighborhood score, and this is, when we zoom in on this area, you can see that it's all agriculture, which we discussed beforehand. They, according to this model, do not have great neighborhood scores because they're not near parks as much. However, they do have a lot of access to nature, more so than someone in the downtown area would have. So it can be argued that this is a better neighborhood than this model suggests. And then we also mapped the extremes of the scatter plot. So here is arguably the worst neighborhood and the most vulnerable people. And if we zoom in on this area, we can see they're right in between two major highways. Even though the river is close, there's a lot of concrete in between them, so it's unlikely they will go over there. And it's just sort of a concrete jungle where a child is not likely to spend a lot of time in nature. And then this is the exact opposite. The best neighborhoods go with the least vulnerable people. So as you can see, it's around a lake. This is Lake Minnetonka, a very famous lake in the Twin Cities area. So people that live around here are not vulnerable at all and have an amazing neighborhood score because they have so much access to nature and parks and neighborhood amenities. So they live in a great neighborhood and they are not vulnerable people. So some follow-up research on this. After looking at this, it's clear to say that, we want to build a lot of parks in very vulnerable neighborhoods. We want to conserve forests and conserve nature around vulnerable people. However, we have to be careful when we do this. In this study, Protecting Ecosystems and Alleviating Poverty with Parks and Reserves, Win-Win or Trade-Offs, they found that the characteristics associated with the most avoided deforestation are the characteristics associated with the least poverty alleviation. So, although these people are trying to conserve nature, they are actually hurting the poor population in these areas. And here's another article called Conservation, Human Rights, and Poverty Reduction, and they found that between 50 and 100% of stricter protected areas in South America and Asia are used or occupied by people. This is illegal, so as legislation gets stricter and people are kicked out of these areas to preserve the nature, these people have nowhere to go, and that is very dangerous because these people are losing their homes at the cost of protecting an area of nature. So it's important to protect nature. However, we need to make sure that we're thinking about people when we do it as well. So we're thinking about these people who live in these bad neighborhoods, and how can we make those neighborhoods better, not necessarily by kicking out the vulnerable people and making the neighborhood better, but making the neighborhood better for those vulnerable people. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.